I was told to be quiet, to simply sit and observe, at my own husband's estate dinner. They dismissed me as just the widow, as if I hadn't painstakingly built this family from the ground up. I offered a polite smile, rose from my seat, and departed without uttering a single word. Their laughter echoed behind me as I closed the door. Yet, by sunrise, their financial accounts were frozen, their residences secured, and every possession they believed to be theirs was legally mine. And my actions were far from complete. Before proceeding, please ensure you've liked this video and subscribed to my channel so you won't miss future captivating stories. Also, please comment and let me know where you're watching from. Thank you. My name is Evelyn Reed. I'm 67 years old, and to my family, apparently, that makes me merely the widow. I meticulously pressed my blouse twice, checked my lipstick 3 times, and firmly resolved to maintain composure, regardless of the circumstances. Was it simply a dinner? A family gathering? A casual meeting with the people I'd cherished and nurtured for over 4 decades? The gathering was to be held at my son, Ethan's, expansive glass residence, the one he and Gabriella purchased after my late husband, Arthur, and I co-signed their loan. A detail conveniently omitted from current conversations. The ostensible purpose of the gathering was to discuss estate matters, the house, the lakefront property, and the retirement funds. These were assets Arthur and I had meticulously constructed, often foregoing lunches and vacations for 2 decades, opting for budget-friendly canned soup instead. I brought a cherry pie, a recipe Arthur always adored, hoping it might ameliorate the tension. Upon entering, everyone remained fixated on their own activities. Ethan was already pouring wine with the practiced ease of a sommelier, while Gabriella, resplendent in golden heels and a saccharine smile, moved about the kitchen with an air of ownership. Their eldest, Oliver, acknowledged me with a curt nod, the kind one offers a distant acquaintance at a funeral. The atmosphere was thick with cloying perfume and the acrid scent of something burning in the oven. We assembled, 9 of us, around the dining table I'd gifted them the previous Christmas. Ethan began, "We've considered simplifying matters," a statement whose meaning was crystal clear, less influence from me, and more power for them. When I politely inquired, "Have you consulted with our legal counsel regarding the trust?" Gabriella barely glanced up from her phone, muttering, "You're just the widow, Evelyn. Perhaps you should remain silent for the present." A heavy silence descended. Then Ethan chuckled, followed by my other son, Samuel, as if it were a comedic punchline. My hands trembled beneath the table, not from weakness, but from the crushing weight of that moment, a repetition of the grief I felt upon losing Arthur, but this time, I was the one being marginalized. I scanned their faces, their expressions vacant, as if I were merely a placeholder, lacking any true identity. I set down my fork, stood, and remained silent. I refused to grant them the satisfaction of witnessing my tears or hearing a lengthy speech. I left the untouched pie and proceeded to my vehicle. Locking the door, I allowed myself, for the first time in 42 years, to embrace the silence, experiencing it not as loneliness but as peace. They didn't even call after me, completely oblivious to my impending actions. I didn't sleep that night, not a wink, instead settling into Arthur's worn brown recliner, wrapped in the familiar throw blanket, the one with frayed edges and a faint coffee stain he never noticed, that we'd often bickered over on chilly evenings. The stillness of the room felt heavy, as I replayed their words incessantly in my mind, "You're just the widow. Perhaps you should remain silent." As if I were an inconsequential extra in my own family's narrative. Around 2:30 a.m., unable to bear the oppressive quiet, I rose and walked barefoot to the cabinet we'd always kept out of reach from the boys. We called it the no-touch drawer, where we stored passports, titles, old wills, tax documents, things they weren't privy to. My hands were icy as I opened it. I didn't know exactly what I was seeking, perhaps a reminder of my continued place within the family, evidence that Arthur hadn't left me entirely vulnerable. I moved aside familiar papers, insurance documents, birth certificates, and an old photograph of us in the Rocky Mountains. Then I saw it, a thick white envelope tucked in the back, inscribed in Arthur's handwriting with a single word, "Evelyn." I stared at it, fearing it might vanish. Arthur wasn't given to sentimental gestures, he expressed his love through practical acts, ensuring tire rotations and unclogged gutters, not through written words. I opened it slowly, my hands already trembling. Inside was a single sheet of notebook paper and a stack of clipped documents. The letter began, "If you're reading this, something has already gone awry. I wished to inform you earlier, but I knew you'd attempt to rectify the situation rather than protect yourself. The boys, they're not inherently malicious, but they are selfish, and Gabriella, she's far worse. I observed this developing upon my illness, so I made certain adjustments. Everything is in your name, the house, the accounts, the lake property. You possess full authority, power of attorney. They are unaware. Do not feel remorse for utilizing it. Do not permit them to silence you through shame. And if they ever attempt to seize what is rightfully yours, destroy it all." I sat there, paralyzed, the implications sinking in. I had been completely unaware of his actions. We'd discussed the will in general terms, but I believed he was merely exercising caution. I examined the documents, official, notarized, bearing our lawyer, Allen's, stamp, legally sound and binding. There were clauses I barely understood at the time, financial control clauses, ownership restructuring, and asset transfer effective upon death. It was all there. Arthur had rewritten everything 8 months prior. His passing occurred during a period of doctor's visits and experimental medications. He'd done it discreetly, decisively, likely after witnessing Ethan's furtive examination of his business records and Gabriella's oddly solicitous inquiries about next steps. I could almost hear Arthur's voice urging me to remain resolute, to cease underestimating my own capabilities. I brewed tea to occupy my hands, though I didn't drink it. I paced the kitchen, re-examined the documents, and meticulously verified the signature dates. It was authentic. Everything. And as I scrutinized it, I felt a profound shift within me. The feeling of invisibility, of being an insignificant appendage in someone else's legacy, was replaced by something else entirely: control. At 3:47 a.m., I picked up the landline and contacted Alan Kramer, our lawyer for over 30 years, the one who subtly slipped Arthur fishing magazines during meetings and always addressed me as Mrs. Reed, even after I requested he stop. He answered after 4 rings, groggy but attentive upon hearing my name. I was direct. "Arthur left everything to me. I've located the paperwork. I wish to activate it immediately." He paused, then asked if anyone else was aware. I replied in the negative. "Excellent," he said. "Do not inform them. I will arrive by 9 with all necessary documentation." I hung up and stood in the hallway, gazing at an old wedding photograph on the wall, Arthur and me on the courthouse steps, young, apprehensive, yet utterly in sync. I touched the frame and whispered, "I've secured it now. You no longer need to worry." I then resumed my seat, neatly folded the documents into a manila folder, and placed it in my purse, as if it were a weapon. Because, in essence, that's precisely what it was. If they believed I would passively accept their attempts to dismantle my life, they were about to discover the true measure of the woman they'd dismissed. By the time Alan rang the doorbell at 8:57 a.m., I was fully prepared, dressed, made up, my hair styled as Arthur preferred, with the documents spread across the dining table like a strategic map, accompanied by a notebook filled with questions I'd jotted down while pacing throughout the night. He entered carrying his briefcase and that same well-worn leather portfolio he'd used since the boys were in elementary school. Upon seeing the envelope Arthur had left me, his expression transformed from professional concern to a grim respect. We spent 2 hours meticulously reviewing every clause, every legal term, every contingency. By 11:15 a.m., I had signed 6 documents transferring control of every asset, property, account, and business interest into my name. Alan made the final call to the estate manager, verbally confirming that all future instructions should originate solely from me, not Ethan, not Samuel, not even the trust, only me. The surreal sensation of hearing him state it aloud was overwhelming. All further authorizations rested solely with Mrs. Evelyn Reed. I believe I held my breath for a full minute. He then looked at me and asked, Do you prefer they discover this through their accounts, or would you like to convene a meeting? I considered this for a moment. Then I instructed him, let them feel the impact. Let it strike them like a sudden collision. He smiled. Excellent. That's the Evelyn I remember. And just like that, it was concluded. I spent the remainder of the afternoon contacting Arthur's brokerage manager, the property firm, the title company, and the accountant, each confirming that my name was now the sole authority. By 3 p.m., I received a text from Ethan, odd question, but are you aware why access to the cabin accounts has been blocked? I didn't respond. 5 minutes later, Gabriella called. I allowed it to go to voicemail. Her tone was sharp yet sugary, her usual demeanor when attempting to manipulate someone. By 4:30 p.m., the group chat was ablaze with messages concerning unexpected account irregularities. Samuel, rarely vocal, finally sent, "Did someone alter the access on Mom's end?" That's when I knew the panic had begun. They hadn't fully grasped the extent of my actions, but the initial shock had landed. And the aftershocks were imminent. I waited until 5:05 p.m., anticipating their return to Ethan's for another strategic dinner. I ascended the stone pathway, folder in hand, and knocked on the door as if merely delivering a casserole. Ethan opened it, displaying a mixture of confusion and irritation, his artificial smile faltering. I entered, placed the folder on the counter, and announced, "You might wish to be seated." They didn't comply. Naturally. Gabriella leaned against the counter with arms crossed, while Samuel lingered in the hallway, seemingly poised to retreat. I slowly opened the folder, displayed the documents, and stated, "This is the revised estate plan. Everything is under my name." Everything. Silence. Not shocked silence, but arrogant silence, the type that believes it's on the verge of outsmarting you. Ethan scoffed and remarked, "You can't simply reallocate funds without the trustees' board's approval." I met his gaze directly. There is no trustees' board. Arthur dissolved it last year. You failed to read the fine print. Gabriella stepped forward, attempting to examine the papers with her long, manicured nails, maintaining her practiced smile. "There's no way this is legally binding," she asserted. That's when I handed her the final document, the notarized copy bearing Alan's signature and date stamp. She froze. I took a deliberate step back and said, "This isn't a negotiation. This is a notification. And as of this morning, you possess no legal claim to any of it." No one moved. No one spoke. For the first time in years, the room was still while I occupied it. I turned to leave, pausing at the door to add, "Should you wish to discuss my future, you will require an appointment." I didn't slam the door, didn't deliver a speech, didn't cry. I simply departed, leaving them standing in the house Arthur and I had purchased, choking on the illusion of control. The following morning, as I prepared coffee in my kitchen, the old drip machine sputtering as usual, I could already sense the rising tension before even checking my phone. 5 missed calls from Ethan, 3 from Gabriella, and 1 from Samuel, who predictably waited until the storm broke before making contact. I ignored them all, settling at the table with my mug, watching the steam rise and contemplating whether they'd managed a full night's rest. A part of me hoped they hadn't. Around 9:12 a.m., Ethan finally sent a less aggressive, more confused text, "Can we simply talk?" That spoke volumes. They were unraveling. By noon, Alan called to inform me that Ethan had attempted to access 2 accounts from his work laptop, both attempts flagged by the system. I told Alan, "Excellent. Let him continue his investigation." An hour later, Gabriella appeared uninvited at my doorstep, sporting oversized sunglasses as if I wouldn't recognize her despite the tinted lenses and lip fillers. I didn't invite her in. She stood on the porch as if delivering unpleasant news to an unliked neighbor. "Evelyn, we're all somewhat perplexed," she began, employing that strained smile and voice she uses when feigning composure. "Why would Arthur do this behind everyone's back?" I looked her directly in the eyes. "Perhaps because he anticipated your actions." She flinched as if I'd struck her. I added, "You should depart. This constitutes trespassing." She attempted a veiled threat about legal action, but I closed the door before she finished. 10 minutes later, Samuel called, his voice low, as if he didn't want his wife to overhear. "Mom, I was unaware of any of this." The trust was simply automatic. I wasn't even aware Gabriella and Ethan were maneuvering for control. I could detect guilt, or perhaps the fear of being ostracized. I stated, "You had ample opportunity to inquire directly." He didn't respond, simply hanging up. That night, I prepared a dinner for one: roasted chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, and lemon green beans, a far cry from the meager meals I'd endured while others feasted on the fruits of my labor. As I poured a glass of wine, the landline rang. This time it was Ava, Ethan and Gabriella's 17-year-old daughter, the only one who consistently made eye contact during family gatherings. Her voice was soft, almost trembling. "Grandma, I'm unsure what's happening, but Mom and Dad are distraught. They mentioned something about missing funds and the house being jeopardized. Are you all right?" This struck me more profoundly than anything else. My demeanor softened. "I'm fine, sweetheart. You haven't done anything wrong." She hesitated, then whispered, "I miss Grandpa. He would have detested this." I swallowed and offered her the truth. That's why he rectified the situation before it could escalate. After we disconnected, I sat alone at the table, enveloped in quiet, experiencing something I hadn't felt since the funeral: not grief, not rage, but clarity. Arthur had foreseen this impending chaos, and now they were struggling without a safety net. Ethan had lost access to the accounts he believed were his. Gabriella had no legal claim to the house she flaunted to her yoga companions. Samuel was only now realizing that silence didn't equate to innocence, and Ava, the only one with a semblance of compassion left in that family, was caught in the crossfire. I knew this was just the beginning. People of their ilk don't surrender easily. They maneuver, they twist, they seek loopholes. But what they hadn't yet grasped was that I wasn't merely a grieving widow awaiting their approval. I was the bulwark now. And if they intended to challenge me, they'd best be prepared for the ensuing repercussions. 2 days after dismissing Gabriella and delivering that wordless message, Alan called again, his tone compelling me to sit down before he even began speaking. "There's something you need to see," he said, "and it requires an hour of your time." Later, I sat across from him in his office, the same place Arthur and I used to visit each April to sign documents and consume lukewarm coffee from chipped mugs. He pushed a folder across the desk without speaking. At first, I didn't comprehend its contents: a series of bank statements, account transfers, loan agreements, all bearing Ethan's name. "He used your husband's business line of credit as collateral," Alan finally explained. $500,000, perhaps more, depending on what remains to be uncovered. He signed them as a partner, but that partnership dissolved upon Henry's passing. Meaning these transactions were fraudulent. My hands grew icy. I flipped through the papers again, more slowly this time, observing how the dates and figures began to align. The new SUV Ethan had purchased the previous year, the sudden kitchen renovation, the ski trip to Aspen they'd attributed to friends, it was all linked to funds he had no right to access. He did this while Arthur was still ill? I asked, my voice quieter than intended. Alan nodded. "We believe so." The first transaction occurred 2 weeks after Arthur's initial surgery. I stared at the figures until they ceased to appear as mere numbers, transforming into a representation of betrayal, the insidious kind that corrodes from within. Alan leaned forward. "We can file charges if you wish. Or we can simply allow the financial constraints to tighten and watch him squirm. Your decision." I remained silent. "Not yet. I needed time to process this." I drove home without music, without stopping, proceeding directly to Arthur's study, largely untouched, and retrieved the old leather journal he kept behind the encyclopedias. He'd jotted down notes during tax season, and sure enough, on one of the final pages, in his neat, slanted handwriting, was a list of items to verify. Ethan's withdrawals? Suspicious. Inquire with Alan. He must have known. He must have suspected, but lacked the opportunity to resolve it. And now it was my responsibility to fulfill what he couldn't. That night, sleep eluded me again. I sat at the kitchen table, the documents spread before me like puzzle pieces, staring at the evidence that my son, my own flesh and blood, had defrauded us while we were grappling with doctor's visits and chemotherapy side effects. I wanted to scream, but I refrained. I created another folder, labeled it firewood, and began making notes. Which assets could I liquidate? Which debts could I call in? Which investments could I freeze that Ethan might still be connected to? The following morning, I contacted Alan. Don't file charges yet. Let him simmer. I want him bankrupt before he becomes truly afraid. That same day, I contacted the estate accountant, a man named Peter whom I hadn't seen since Arthur's retirement party. I asked him directly, "Were you aware of any of this?" He didn't deny it. "I had reservations," he admitted. "But your name wasn't on anything until now." My hands were tied. I responded, "Well, that's no longer the case. Begin speaking." And he did. For over an hour. He detailed suspicious fund movements, red flags he couldn't investigate without authorization, and how Ethan had likely accumulated debt under the false assumption that upon Arthur's death, he would inherit everything and could subsequently rectify the situation. It wasn't just greed, it was arrogance. He never once considered that I would be the one holding the pen when the dust settled. That night, I sent Ethan a single message: "You might want to consult a lawyer, an accountant, and secure a very affordable apartment." I didn't receive a reply. But I didn't need one. Because the only sound louder than his silence was the sound of everything he believed was his slipping through my fingers. 3 days later, they invited me to a family barbecue as if nothing had transpired, as if we hadn't appended the family tree and shaken out all the rotten branches. And while every instinct urged me to stay home and let them wallow in their deceit, I attended because sometimes silence isn't power, visibility is. I wore the pearl earrings Arthur had given me for our 30th anniversary and brought a bottle of red wine I knew none of them could afford. As I entered the backyard, the entire scene felt contrived, utterly artificial. Plastic tablecloths, strained smiles, and music loud enough to mask genuine conversation. Gabriella was dressed in white, as if attempting to prove a point. Ethan stood behind the grill, feigning the role of provider, flipping burgers as if the world wasn't crumbling beneath his feet. Samuel nodded awkwardly, unsure whether to feel anger or relief. I didn't delay. I approached the picnic table, placed the firewood folder on it, and declared, "We need to talk. Now." Gabriella rolled her eyes. Ethan muttered something inaudible, and Samuel reached for a beer like a child trying to avoid a confrontation. I opened the folder and displayed the documents, the loan fraud, the forged partnership extension, the fund transfers, everything. "This is what Ethan did while your father was dying," I stated flatly, without raising my voice. "Because people don't forget what you say, they remember how calm you were when you said it." Ethan barked a laugh. "This is preposterous." "That's not even," but I interrupted him. "It's not conjecture. It's notarized. Confirmed. And the only reason you're not incarcerated is because I'm granting you one final opportunity to accept responsibility." Gabriella stepped forward, her voice shrill and unsteady. "This is a setup. He didn't steal anything. Arthur would have informed us." I turned to her slowly, maintaining eye contact. "Arthur witnessed it. He simply didn't trust you to rectify it." For the first time, she was speechless. Ava, who had been sitting quietly near the fence, looked at me with wide eyes, as if finally seeing the cracks in the narrative she'd been conditioned to believe. I turned back to Ethan. "You will begin transferring assets today, the vehicles, the cabin furnishings, the business inventory. You don't get to enjoy the spoils of what you attempted to destroy." Ethan clenched his jaw, his chest heaving. "You're going to ruin the entire family over some paperwork?" I leaned in slightly. "No. You did that when you stole from your father's grave." That silenced him. I turned, walked toward the back gate, and heard someone, likely Gabriella, mutter, "You're bitter. That's all you are." A bitter old woman who couldn't let go. I stopped, without turning around, and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "No. I'm the woman who financed this entire property, and I've simply decided you're no longer welcome here." Then I walked through the gate and didn't look back. Upon returning home, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the porch, watching the sun set, pondering how it was possible to feel grief and power simultaneously. I wasn't happy, but I was free, and freedom, it turns out, tastes infinitely better than forced smiles and stolen money. The following Monday, I met with a real estate attorney and provided him with a list of properties Arthur and I still legally owned: the lake house Ethan bragged about on social media, the downtown condo Samuel had been secretly renting out for cash under the table, and even the SUV Gabriella used to transport Ava to school, claiming it was a gift from Ethan's hard work, when in reality, the lease bore Arthur's signature, and now, legally mine. I signed the transfer orders one by one, without hesitation or ceremony, each clean, cold signature feeling like the removal of a malignant growth from the body of a family that had ceased functioning years ago. The lawyer inquired whether I wished to inform them personally or allow the paperwork to speak for itself. I replied they didn't include me when they believed they were dividing the spoils. I won't provide them a platform now that their empire is collapsing. By Friday, Ethan's business account had been depleted of illegally acquired funds, Gabriella's credit cards were declined at a high-end boutique, and Samuel called me breathlessly, asking if the building manager was serious about terminating his lease. His lease? I confirmed. Yes, I replied, and the next tenant will pay rent, like everyone else. Gabriella, naturally, didn't surrender quietly. She reappeared, this time red-faced, screaming at my doorstep like a banshee in designer heels, demanding answers, threatening to accuse me of elder abuse, despite my superior posture, legal standing, and frankly, better complexion than hers, despite her cosmetic enhancements. I didn't open the door. I didn't speak. I simply stood behind the slightly ajar blinds and watched her unravel until she gave up and stormed off. The next morning, I had a locksmith change the locks at the cabin. The day after that, the SUV was repossessed from Ethan's driveway during brunch, observed by their neighbors from behind their hedges. I wasn't motivated by revenge. I was reclaiming what was rightfully mine, what Arthur and I had built brick by brick while they watched from the sidelines, anticipating the inheritance feast. Ava texted me that night, "Dad's losing it. They're discussing moving in with Aunt Brenda. Is this permanent?" I stared at the screen before replying, "Actions are permanent. So are consequences." She didn't respond, but I saw her typing and stopping several times, as if she wanted to say more. I understood. She was caught between the people who raised her and the truth they'd kept concealed. That night, I slept better than I had in months. No dreams, no tossing and turning, just a profound quiet that settled into my bones, peace finally piercing through the noise. When I awoke, I had a new email from the estate's financial advisor confirming that every significant asset had been recovered, liquidated, or reassigned. The message concluded with a sentence I couldn't stop rereading: "You now hold 100% control." And for the first time since Arthur's death, I truly believed it. I was halfway through my breakfast when the doorbell rang. Before I could reach the window, I saw a white envelope slide under the door. No return address, only my name printed in shaky handwriting. Initially, I assumed it was from Ava, perhaps a handwritten note she didn't want to send electronically. But when I opened it, what fell out halted me. A copy of a psychiatric assessment form, and signed but aggressively highlighted in red around the words, "Capacity Evaluation Recommended." I recognized it instantly. I'd seen enough of Arthur's legal documents to identify a setup when I encountered one. Someone, and I didn't need a second to guess who, was attempting to file paperwork to challenge my control of the estate, claiming I was mentally incapacitated. I held the page, feeling not fear, but a cold, slow burn of resentment, as if they'd finally exhausted their courage and resorted to cowardice. That afternoon, I drove to Alan's office and placed the envelope on his desk without speaking. He glanced at it, his eyebrows slowly rising. "They actually pursued this route? That's audacious." I nodded and instructed, "Trace it." I want to know who commissioned the evaluation, who authored it, and who forged the access." 2 days later, Alan called back, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. It was Gabriella. She approached a notary who owed her a favor and attempted to backdate the file. "We have emails," and one of the assistants voluntarily turned over evidence. Apparently, she didn't appreciate being asked to commit a felony on a Sunday morning. I said, "File charges." He responded, "Already in progress." That evening, a sheriff's vehicle pulled into Ethan's driveway as they were unloading groceries from a borrowed car. Neighbors emerged like moths to a flame. Gabriella screamed, shouted, and sobbed, a performance she'd likely rehearsed countless times, but it didn't prevent them from arresting her on the sidewalk and reading her the charges: forgery, fraud, and attempted abuse of the legal system. Ethan attempted to intervene, but the deputy quickly subdued him. I wasn't present, but Ava later recounted the event. She spoke quietly, as if ashamed of them. "She tried to claim it was my fault," Ava whispered, "but nobody believed her, not even Dad. I told Ava, some people don't break. They decay from the inside until nothing remains but noise." She didn't respond, but I could hear her breathing, and for once, it felt as though someone in that household had glimpsed the truth. That night, I poured a drink, opened the old photo album Arthur used to browse when he missed the boys, and stared at their toddler faces, not because I missed them, but because I needed to remind myself that I had once loved them. I didn't do what I did out of hatred, I did it because I was the only one who remembered the sacrifices made to build it all. And if protecting that meant sending one of them to jail, so be it. Gabriella had wagered everything on the assumption that I would succumb, that I would feel shame, weakness, or be too old to fight. She hadn't realized I ceased being afraid the day they told me to sit quietly in a room I had financed. I was finished being polite, and this time I would complete the task. The court hearing for Gabriella's arraignment was brief and harsh, mirroring the damage she'd attempted to inflict, and I didn't bother attending. Alan sent me a message afterward, conveying it succinctly: she accepted a plea bargain. I didn't require details. I knew Gabriella wouldn't risk a trial, not with digital records linked to her personal email and witness statements from the notary's assistant, who provided sworn testimony in exchange for immunity. The plea bargain meant no prison time, but a permanent record and a fine substantial enough to disrupt their remaining financial stability. Ethan didn't communicate with me afterward, not to defend Gabriella, not even to threaten me. Just radio silence, the kind that signals someone has finally realized the ground beneath them has vanished. I spent the following week shifting my focus, not out of revenge, but necessity. There were taxes to file, property closures to finalize, and most importantly, decisions to make regarding the aftermath of this conflict. I wouldn't cling to every asset like a miser. That had never been my intention. I simply wanted what was mine, what Arthur and I had built, to be protected from corruption. So I contacted Peter, the estate accountant, and instructed him to transfer ownership of the smaller house outside town, the one with the porch swing and yellow shutters Arthur always said reminded him of his grandmother's home, into Ava's name. She hadn't requested it, she hadn't anticipated it. But she was the only one in that family who hadn't attempted to manipulate me, who hadn't looked away when things grew difficult, and I wanted her to possess something that couldn't be seized or reclaimed. She wept when I informed her. Not a theatrical display, but a soft, shocked reaction, as if it had released something she'd been holding onto too tightly. "I don't deserve this," she said. And I told her, "You do. Because you didn't pretend." That same week, I began collaborating with a nonprofit consultant to establish the Arthur Reed Second Chance Fund, a grant program for widowed women over 60 who'd been sidelined, excluded from financial decisions, or left with meager resources after their husbands' deaths. I didn't want a plaque or a ceremony, I simply wanted something enduring, something that transcended pain. The first application arrived before the website even launched, a handwritten letter from a woman in Kentucky whose children had emptied her bank account the day after the funeral. I approved her application within 2 hours. One evening, while sorting through paperwork, I discovered an old note Arthur had scribbled on a dry cleaning receipt tucked between pages of his retirement binder. It read, "Ensure Evelyn knows she did it all." I didn't cry. I carefully folded it and placed it in the top drawer of his desk, where I kept the original will, the keys, and now, peace. By Friday, I had closed the final joint account linked to Ethan's fraudulent LLC, donated the remaining inventory to a local business incubator, and sent a formal cease and desist letter to the last law firm foolish enough to still represent him. The rebuilding wasn't glamorous, it wasn't enjoyable. But it was mine and Arthur's, no longer burdened by the avaricious specters of people who shared his blood but none of his integrity. And for the first time, as I sat on my front porch sipping coffee while contractors replaced the decaying fence panels we'd postponed repairing for years, I realized I was no longer merely surviving, I was rebuilding from the ashes. And I was doing so on my own terms. It wasn't until I stood before that long, polished table again, the same one where they'd instructed me to remain silent just weeks earlier, that I realized how far I'd progressed, and how far they'd fallen. Not a single part of me felt remorse. Ethan himself had sent the invitation, framing it as a casual reunion, some nonsense about reconnecting and resetting, as if this were a technical malfunction or a familial glitch that could be resolved with burgers and forced apologies. I didn't go to forgive anyone. I went because sometimes the people who attempt to erase you need to witness you standing at full height, no longer seeking permission to exist. Gabriella wasn't present. Part of her plea bargain involved avoiding contact with me for at least 6 months. Samuel hovered in the background, seemingly wanting to speak but unsure how to begin. Ava sat beside me, her hands folded calmly, watchful, as if finally learning to be resolute in a room filled with deception. Ethan stood at the head of the table as if it were still his domain, his legacy. But even he appeared diminished now, thinner, drained, as if he'd finally ceased believing his own fabrication. He began with a rehearsed line about families weathering storms and handling things differently, but I wasn't interested in his script. I set down my glass, looked at everyone in the room, and declared, "This isn't a storm. This is the consequence. And each of you contributed to it." You could hear a pin drop. No one reached for water, no one fidgeted. Ethan opened his mouth, perhaps to defend himself or offer another excuse, but I stopped him with a raised hand. "You told me I was merely the widow, that I should remain silent. But I wasn't silent when I built this family. I wasn't silent when I sustained it. And I certainly won't be silent now that I've reclaimed it." I paused, allowing that to sink in. Then I added, "This table, this room, I own them. Legally, emotionally, structurally. Remember that." I stood without awaiting a response. As I walked toward the door, I turned back one last time. "You don't have to like me. You simply have to understand that I'm finished making myself insignificant so you can feel important." Then I departed. Not out of anger, but because I was finished. Outside, the sky was clear and bright, the kind of light Arthur used to describe as ideal for yard work. And as I entered my car, I didn't feel triumphant, smug, or even proud. I felt settled. I had confronted the fire and emerged unscathed. And now I could rebuild, not because someone had granted me permission, but because I had granted it to myself. And that, more than any revenge, inheritance, or title, was the victory I never anticipated but undeniably earned.